train got closer and closer. The demon form of the engine with sparks flying from its funnel came up along the track. His puffing was drowned in the roar of the train itself. The whole train could be seen clearly against the warm moonlight. From the coal tender to the tail end, there was a solid cluster of human beings on the roof. The man was still stretched on the rope. The leader stood up and shouted hysterically, "Come off, you ass! You'll be killed. Come off at once." The man turned round toward the voice. He whipped out a small kirpan from his waist and began to slash at the rope. "Who is this? What is he?" There was no time. They looked from the bridge to the train and from the train to the bridge. The man hacked at the rope vigorously. The leader raised his rifle to his shoulder and fired. He hit his mark, and one of the man's legs came off the rope and dangled in the air. The other was still twined round the rope. He slashed away in frantic haste. The engine was only a few yards off, throwing embers up in the sky. Somebody fired another shot. The man's body slid off the rope, but clung to it with the hands and the chin. He pulled himself up, caught the rope under his armpit, and again started hacking with his right hand. The rope had been cut in shreds. Only a thin, tough strand remained. He went at it with his knife and then with his teeth. The engine was almost on him. There was a volley of shots. A man shivered and collapsed. The rope snapped in the center as he fell. The train went over him and went on to Pakistan. I drove from Kasauli to Delhi alone. And it was an eerie experience. As I got to Kalka to fill up petrol, I realized there's not a soul to be seen on the road. All the way from Delhi till I got to nearly 30 miles close to Delhi when I saw a jeep standing in the middle of the road, and I pulled up a distance away. All I had was a pistol in my hand, which I never fired. And then I recognized the people in the police were in the jeep were all Sardars. So I drove towards them, they drove towards me. And I asked them what they'd done, and it was chilling. They said they'd wiped out every Muslim in the villages nearby. And with that, I drove into Delhi in the evening. And next day, I was outside the Parliament building to hear Nehru's famous Tryst with Destiny speech, and Sucheta Kripalani singing Bande Mataram, joined the crowds in shouting Mahatma Gandhi ki jai and all that kind of thing. The impact of the partition had not really, it's like your arm being cut off and you don't realize till after some time what has happened. And the next 2 or 3 days went in this euphoria before I realized what had happened, that I'd never be able to go back to my home in Lahore, that millions of refugees were pouring out of Pakistan into India and from India into Pakistan. The experience was something that haunted me. And I started making notes. I said, this must be put on record. That's why I don't call Train to Pakistan a novel. It's really a documentary built on a contrived story. But fortunately for me, it passed off as a novel, got filmed, won an award, and got translated in almost all the languages of the world. It's curious to mention that it was first published in the name of the village, Mano Majra. It got some reviews and notices and won a prize, but it when it came, I changed the title deliberately when it came to being published in England. I changed the title from Mano Majra to Train to Pakistan, and immediately the book started selling and being taken notice of. Just every Pakistani felt he must read it. As a Sardar writing about Pakistan. They thought it would be very anti-Pakistani. It was nothing of the kind. It was just the other way around. And it is a little unfortunate that I've come to be known only as the author of Train to Pakistan. I've written other novels which I think are considerably better, particularly the second one, which is almost no one knows about. I Shall Not Hear the Nightingale. It's just been lost.
Train to Pakistan went on to become a classic. Other books followed at regular intervals, each one of them succeeding in breaking a fresh ground, each one of them different from the previous in theme, approach and style. A writing style that is characteristically his own, a style that has always captivated readers at home and abroad. And the most successful of them all is History of the Sikhs, which together with Train to Pakistan will ensure for him a permanent place in the annals of letters in India. But along with these, there has also been considerable trivia, books of lesser import, different and wide-ranging nevertheless, from biographies to Nature Watch. What really happened, and how instead of trying to produce another significant novel, he switched gears and turned to writing an authoritative 2-volume History of the Sikhs.
Many years ago, I decided, when I decided to take up my career as a writer, was to specialize on one subject so that my name would be associated with it. So I decided to specialize on Sikh history, because being a Sikh, I was brought up with certain amount of background. And I wrote a short history of the Sikhs, which was published way back, I think 1950, 51. A very unsatisfactory book, but it got very good notices in the English press. Then the Rockefeller Foundation approached me and said, would I like to work on a more detailed history? And I decided to do so. And they gave me a 3 or 4 year grant, which enabled me to travel all over the world wherever there were Sikh communities, to work at the India Office Library in London, where the records really are. And because I wanted to do this as a kind of my life's contribution. And I worked 4 or 5 years entirely on Sikh history, translating selected passages of the scriptures, writing about it right from the advent of Sikhism right down to 1984 or something. And it was accepted. It was published in America first by the Princeton Press, then by the Oxford University Press, and now in paperbacks here. I know it's not acceptable to the Orthodox Sikh, but otherwise I think I'm not wrong in saying it remains the definitive work on my community. And at the end of my volume 2, I wrote 2 words in Latin, which people don't connect with the book. It is opus exegi, which means my life's work is done. I really was more apprehensive that I may not be able to finish this, and that's why I wrote this. And thereafter, what I have written, and I've written a great deal thereafter, I think is on borrowed time. That's one thing I really wanted to do, and I expect it will live after me, whatever the controversies may be. And from that, 5 or 6 other books have appeared on the Sikhs, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, Fall of the Sikh Kingdom, and other smaller works, and many assignments followed. I think I was then the only contributor to the Encyclopedia Britannica. All the items appearing under the Sikhs are written by me, and I've been invited abroad to various universities to lecture on the Sikhs. Whenever the topic of the Sikh community comes up, without exception, I am the first person to be called to do so, and I find that extremely rewarding.
In a writing span of 6 decades or more, Khushwant Singh has invited more controversy than any other writer in India. Almost all his major works, be it fiction or history, appeared with a blaze of publicity, often torn apart by the critics, but going on to become bestsellers. He's an instinctive writer, a writer to whom the flights of fantasy or imagination are not necessarily ingredients, a writer who has always drawn material from observed reality. In the long decades following the appearance of Train to Pakistan, he has published only 3 novels: I Shall Not Hear the Nightingale, Delhi and the Company of Women, the latter 2 after long intervals. A sequence of events in his own life during the heady days before partition gave him the idea for his second novel, I Shall Not Hear the Nightingale, a lesser known but a certainly better crafted work of fiction.
The second novel was a kind of life story of conflict in the family. It goes back to 1942, the Quit India movement. The incident is basically true. I placed it in Amritsar when it should have been Delhi, because at that time my father was expecting a knighthood and very involved with the usual way, you know, with the deputy commissioner, governor, whatever. And my younger brother got mixed up with the Quit India movement. He got Mrs. Asif Ali, who was underground, to come and stay in the house without anyone knowing. We had this very large house. So she was in one of the guest rooms without my parents knowing about it. And he was buying cyclo-styling machines for them to produce literature and send it around. Apparently the police was keeping a watch on him and knew about Mrs. Asif Ali's movements. They wanted to know where she was going. And they were surprised to notice that amongst the homes that she'd stayed in was my parents' home, where I also was staying at that time for a short while. And they then arrested my brother, because those days cyclo-styling machines were not allowed without registering who they were for and what for. He claimed it was for the family business, when in fact they couldn't find, he couldn't locate it in the family office. So they arrested him, and it came as a great shock to my father. He didn't know anything about it. And then the commissioner or the deputy commissioner, I think it was Jenkins, who later became governor of Punjab. He sent for my father and he said, look, your son has done this. We are willing to let him off if he tells us who his colleagues were, who the other people involved in it were. And much to everyone's surprise, my father then put his foot down. He went to see my brother and said, look, what you've done was very wrong. You jeopardized my career, whatever. But if you let down your colleagues and name them, don't come back to my house. And the brother was given, he was quite willing to squeal on his colleagues. He didn't. And I must say, to the credit of Jenkins, who was the commissioner, he did not hold it against my father. My father got his knighthood, and the brother came out of jail as a great hero. So I thought this was the good material for a story. So I shifted it to a smaller scene in Amritsar, and instead of making my father the hero, who in fact was the hero, I made the mother the hero. As a woman who went on, when this offer came, prayed all night at the Golden Temple and came back and told her son not to let down his colleagues. And he didn't. And I thought it was a reasonably well-crafted story and was based on facts. Of course, my younger brother never forgave me for writing that story. He recognized himself, so did everyone else. But my regret, I think it is a better novel. And it hasn't done anything, achieved anything like the fame or notoriety Train to Pakistan did. I think the other one has gone into nearly 20 or 30 printings, and the second novel is now on its third printing. After I finished the second novel, I got involved in many other things. But the idea of writing a novel on Delhi been fermenting in my mind. I read Ivo Andrić's novel Bridge on the Drina, which told the story of Yugoslavia on events happening on one bridge. And that gave me the idea that maybe I could tell the story of Delhi in a similar manner, using different things. It didn't quite turn out that way. But I started working on it, I think while I was still doing my research on the Sikhs and teaching in Princeton University. I wrote the first chapter, which happened to be a true event. I picked up a person on the road, on the ridge, who turned out to be a hijra, and I dropped him or her at the bus stand, but that made my mind going as a symbol of Delhi, the hijra who could do everything except reproduce. And I thought Delhi was a sterile city. It'd been through so much, but hadn't produced anything very great. And I used this hijra who I had found on the road and my liaison as a narrator, as the continuing chain. It's very weak, I acknowledge it, but it's a tenuous kind of link which brings the history of Delhi from the time of the Rajputs down to the present times up to 1984. I don't know if I succeeded or not. I'm quite happy with the novel because of the different episodes that I was able to recreate from original sources. This is really more like a personal memoir. I was in my 80s, incapable of really having any meaningful physical relationship or even emotional relationship with any person. But the fantasies kept going around my mind of what I could have done if I was younger. And I mentioned right at the beginning of the book that these are when a man gets old, his libidinous desires shift from the middle where they should be to the head where they don't belong. They become fantasies. It's a series of episodes which I myself had admitted earlier on. They were sexual fantasies of an octogenarian. I did not want to publish it, but I happened to talk about it to my publisher, Viking Penguin, David Davida, and he said, let me have a look at it. So I gave it to him, and he appointed his number 2, Ravi Singh, who put it in shape and this and that, and it's been panned by critics mercilessly, I think, without exception. Very few kind words have been said about it, only by a few people who I think did so out of friendship for me rather than the book. And yet for 6 months it was the top of the bestseller list and earned me more royalties than any other book I've written. So I'm not very proud of the book, but it is an honest book. That's all I can say. Honest confession of a man of his in his later years. It needed some courage to write it.
49 East Sujan Singh Park, an exclusive apartment block in South Central Delhi, built by his father before the partition of India, has been Khushwant Singh's permanent abode for the past 4 decades or so. A pilgrimage center of sorts that has been attracting the ugly and the beautiful, seeking recommendations and endorsements, even blessings from its presiding deity. The house has been a silent witness to his changing moods over the years. Having been at the center stage, and despite his oft against the tide comments on social and political upheavals, Khushwant Singh has also been bestowed with various honors and distinctions, the most notable of these being the Padma Bhushan by the President of India in 1974, an award that he returned in 1984 in protest against the state's siege of the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Nomination to the Rajya Sabha from 1980 to 1986, and Heritage of Punjab that enjoys a privileged position in his living room, which also doubles up as a study. Many regard Khushwant Singh to be a better short story writer than a novelist, an opinion that is not much at variance with his feelings in the matter. But the output has been rather limited, a meager 32 in more than 60 years. And most of these have been written when he is not in his Sujan Singh Park residence. In fact, whenever the place becomes overpowering and his concentration begins to waver, Khushwant Singh shifts to the solitude of his retreat in the mountains for varying durations, at least 6 times a year. And that's where he was completing many of the incomplete stories.
I know I'm better as a short story writer than a novelist. I don't have the stamina for writing a novel, and novels like Delhi are really a string of short stories. The first one I think I ever wrote was the Punjab Pastoral, sarcastic short story on a good man trying to do good things and not getting anywhere. And that was the first short story I wrote. I didn't have it published. I wrote several after that. I collected them on partition when I came out of Lahore and got a job in the Ministry of External Affairs in London and gave them to a publisher. And that got published first in England under the title of Mark Vishnu and Other Stories. And that's how it got started. I continued writing short stories in London, and then I was posted in Canada, where some of my stories first saw in print even before the London collection. They appeared in Harper's Magazine. Pearl Buck was the editor then, and then in several Canadian papers. So I really felt my real métier was the short story. There are some stories which become my favorites because I'm in the, I have a fund of malice inside me, and I try to make fun of people. Of the later stories, one I think entitled The Bottom Pincher. This has become one of my more amusing and light-hearted. I also did one on a Sardarji in Canada who I ran into one day in the street. My short stories are short. I make it a point because otherwise it becomes long, it becomes a novella. I think it should have a few limited characters, not more than 1 or 2. It should have a beginning, a build-up, and an end, like a scorpion's tail, which leaves the person, the reader, in anticipation of how the story is going to end. I've been wanting to go back, but I've been caught up in this column writing. I feel particularly guilty. I've been pressurized to write short stories. I have quite a few half-written short stories. I'm trying to make up now here to write a series of short stories which remain half-written in the past. But in between I got caught up writing novels and translating works and writing histories of the Sikhs and biographies of people. But I hope before my days are over, I'll complete these short stories as well.
Born in 1915 in Hadali, Punjab, with the proverbial golden spoon in his mouth to Lady and Sir Sobha Singh, and educated at the Government College, Lahore, and at the King's College and the Inner Temple in London, Khushwant Singh has sported different colored turbans in his distinguished and eventful life. Beginning as a lawyer in Lahore, he changed profiles in quick succession to be a writer, diplomat, broadcaster, historian, biographer, editor, and a newspaper columnist. It was therefore imperative that he would author his autobiography at some point in his writing career, and which he has done now in the autumn of his life. An account of life that was endorsed by his late wife, despite herself appearing not in a very favorable light. Now 87, he narrates the story of the publication of his autobiography, once again in his inimitable, no-holds-barred manner.
Mainly at the prodding of my daughter. She said, why don't you write a book for me? Although I had dedicated the very first novel, Train to Pakistan, to her, you write your autobiography specially for me. It will be published by my husband, the royalties will come to me, all that kind of thing. So I did tell her and warn her, I said, you may not like to know what a rascal your father was in his younger days. She said, no, that's all right. Everyone has a background. Or the domestic problems I had in my marriage and various other things. So I wrote about a third of it and gave it to her to decide whether I should go on. And she read it, my wife read it, and they said, go ahead. So I went ahead. I haven't obviously put all, because if you put everything, it may become tedious. So I went ahead with it and handed it over. It was to Ravi Dal, my son-in-law, who's publisher. And in his enthusiasm to give it advanced publicity, offered some chapters to different papers. The India Today carried one dealing with Menaka Gandhi's expulsion from Mrs. Gandhi's home. Suddenly I slapped with a legal notice. The judge, Justice Ramamurthy, granted her an injunction. And it took 6 years for the case to be heard. And ultimately the division bench held in my favor. So the book published 6 years after it should have been in the market. And by then Penguin Viking also became part of it because they wanted to make it a joint publication. And is doing reasonably well. There are many misprints and errors because they did it in a hurry lest she slap another kind of injunction. They produced in a hurry. There are many misprints, many errors of fact which have been rectified in the subsequent editions. And now it's in the market, and I'm told they're already into a third printing. And this above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, that then thou canst be false to any man.